So now I will come over here and write npm install /Microsoft-Microsoft -graph enter, and then it will install the module. With the help of this module, we will get the IntelliSense capability for Microsoft Graph within our Visual Studio Code. So now it has installed the module. Now let's proceed further and let's look into the step number 4. So guys, in the step number 4, we need to update the package-solution.json, where we need to update the key called web API permission request. This is required because, as I already mentioned, whenever we want to use Microsoft 365 resource, we must have to consent it that we are going to use this resource, and we have to allow that resource to access it from the Graph API. So for this reason, we are going to perform this step. So we will go inside the package-solution.json file, and where we will update that what resource we are going to use. We have to specify the permission, also what permission we are going to use within our application to access the resource. So let's go to the Visual Studio Code, and over here I will go to the config folder, and within that package-solution, and then I will come over here at the line number 9, enter, and over here I will mention web API permission requests, and within this array we will specify the permissions. For that reason, I am going to start and close curly braces, and within that we need to specify resource, and over here we need to tell which resource it is. Microsoft Graph, Microsoft.graph, and what we want to and what permission we want to give. So we need to define the scope for that. So I'm going to tell a scope over here. Make sure that you are putting comma over here, then it will stop complaining the error. Then over here we need to specify we are going to use the SharePoint resource, remember that, and within the Graph API the SharePoint resource is known as sites, and what we want to do, we want to perform read write both, because we want to read the list and we also want to create the item into the list. For that reason we need to specify over here read write dot all. So that's it, we are done with our web API permission request step, and make sure that you are going to save it. So let's Control S, save it. Now we are done with the step number 4. Now let's proceed further and let's look into the step number 5. So in the step number 5, we need to create a TS file called graph services.ts. So let's do it. So I am inside the Visual Studio Code. Over here I will go to the source folder, web parts, and I will go to the services folder, and I will create another file to write the logic which is based upon Graph API. So let's do it. I will come over here, new file, I will call it as graph services.ts. Enter. Once it is being done, we are done with the step number 5. So let's look into step number 6. So in the step number 6, we need to import MS Graph client from @Microsoft sp-http module. So let's do it. So over here I will come import from @Microsoft sp-http, and I want MS Graph client. Now we are done with the step number 6. Let's look into the step number 7. So in the step number 7, we need to import all the thing which is called as Microsoft Graph from Microsoft-Graph types. So this will give us the IntelliSense capability inside the Visual Studio Code for the Graph library. So let's do it. I will come over here and I will write import star as Microsoft Graph from the rate Microsoft Graph types, semicolon over here also, and over here also. Save it. Now we are done with the step number 7. So let's look into the step number 8. Now in the step number 8, we need to create an interface called iGraph services, and within that we need to define all the operations which we want to perform on SharePoint list using Graph API. So let's do it, and those operations we will implement in the step number 9, but first implement step number 8. So let's do it. So I will come over here in the Visual Studio Code, I will write export interface. The name I am going to give it as iGraph services. We are going to perform 4 operations, and that is our create item, and this create item will accept the object. I will tell item obj, which is of type any, and this function return type is promise any. That's it. Now next operation we will perform the get items, that is the read operation. So I will tell get items, and there is no parameter for this, and the return type is promise, which is of type any. Now third operation is the update item. We will write update item, and for the update operation we need to specify which item we want to update. That will come in the form of item object. I will call it as of type any, then we need to also specify the item ID. So which ID we want to update within the list, and that is of type number. So it requires two parameters, and this function is of type, it will return the promise, and over here we need to specify any, and the last operation is the delete operation. So over here we will tell delete item, we'll call it as ID, because delete function is expecting the ID, which ID you want to delete. So we have to specify that parameter over here, and which is of type number, and the return type is promise any. So now we are done with the step number 8, where we have defined the interface and the operations which we want to perform, so that any of the class is implementing this particular interface, they must have to define all these operations, and that is our step number 9. So let's do it. But prior to doing this, I wanted to show you one thing. If you see our pnpservices.ts, the name I have kept it same because it will help us to integrate our service layer and earlier implementation of UI layer very smoothly. Or say we have to very minimally change our UI layer without changing much of the things within the UI layer, so that it will reduce the testing time. Because in this exercise I want to show that how you can remove the earlier implementation of service layer. Instead of that, you can introduce the graph layer into the existing solution. As industry wise, people are adapting more of the graph usage instead of PNP services, because graphs gives you unified endpoint, that I have already explained that. So if any of the resources which you want to use within your solution, like calendar, planner, any other stuff which you want to use, or say any of the resources which exist inside the Microsoft 365 ecosystem, that you can easily use within your custom solution. So that the reason people are inclined towards, or say industry is inclined towards using the graph API, and over here I have used the graph API, and I have kept the naming convention as is, as our PNP services. So now let's proceed to the step number 9, where we have to define all these functions. So let's look into the step number 9. So guys, this is our step number 9, where we have to create graph service class, and within that we will implement the functions which we have declared inside our iGraph services interface. Now it's time to implement those functions. So let's do it. So I will come over here and I will write export class graph services implements. I'm going to implement iGraph services, and within that I'm going to create a variable called private underscore sp equal to null, and then within that I'm going to implement the constructor as well. Why constructor? Because I'm going to get the context of the web part within that constructor. So let's do it. Because whenever any of the object is being created for this class, the user should pass the web part context to the graph services class. So let's do it. Constructor, over here I will tell context, which is of type web part context. Once you do that, it gets automatically added over here, and then we need to specify over here this dot underscore sp, and over here I will tell context. This is very important. Over here we need to choose MS Graph Client Factory. With the help of this, we are able to grab the reference of all the operations which we want to perform through the Graph API. Once we get this reference, the remaining thing is going to be the same how we have done with the PNP services. So let's do it. Now the next thing, I'm going to create the create item functionality. So let's do it. So over here you will notice that it is complaining the name. Why it is complaining over here? Because it is telling that you are going to implement iGraph services, and to implement this you have to implement all these functionalities. So for that reason, to stop this complaining, let's create all the operations over here. So I will tell public async create item. Now I will copy it 4 times. Now I will change it over here. This is going to be our get items. Make sure that you are removing this one. Now this is going to be the update item. Here it should be update item, and update item has one more parameter, if you remember that is item ID. Copy this one, the signature. What is the signature of it? You will see that it has 2 parameters. So copy that one and paste it over here. One extra this thing here, one extra curly braces was there, that the reason it is throwing error. Now I have removed it. At last we are having delete item. Make sure that you are going to remove this part. So now you will see that it stopped complaining. So now we will start implementing all these operations one by one, but prior to that we need to define some of the constant variables. Why constant variables? That you will come to know in a while. So let's do it. So to create the constant variable, I will go to the shared folder, and over here, if you remember that we have created the constant file, and within that I am going to create constant, and the constant is going to be export const web URL, and the web URL we need to grab the web URL of SharePoint site where our list exists. So let's do it. So I will come over here, I will copy this one and go back to our constant file, and inside the constant file I will put the double quotes, and within that I will paste it, and make sure that we are going to remove this HTTPS. And another thing, if you remember that whenever we are accessing the graph URL, we have to follow some of the standard convention. For that I am going to put a colon over here, and remaining thing is going to be the same. Now next we need to introduce another constant that is called list ID. So I will write export const, and over here I need to mention list ID, and we need to grab the list ID and we will specify over here. So let's grab it. So to grab the list ID, as I already mentioned, we need to go inside the event registration list, and over here we need to go inside the list settings, and at top you will find that this particular ID. So you need to grab after B %7B and grab till this particular percentage, because this %7B and %7D is the encoded version of curly braces. So copy this one and go back to the Visual Studio Code, and we will paste it over there. I'm inside the Visual Studio Code and I will paste it over here. Now we are done with the constant creation, because these constant will be used while creating the request URL for Graph API. So now let's go back to the graph services.ts file and make sure that you are saving it. And now I will come over here and I will import those constants. So let me import that. I will come over here, I will write import, and over here I need to specify. I will come over here, I will tell web URL as well as list ID, and which is coming from shared, and within that constants. So now we got the reference of web URL as well as list ID, and that we are going to use inside our these operations. So now let's write it. To write the logic, I am going to use the try catch block because it is very much good practice to use the try catch block. So over here I will write my entire logic inside the try block, and over here I will create a variable called request URL, and over here we will form the graph API URL so that we will use it. So I will call over here request URL, and I am going to use the template string, and over here /sites $, and I am going to use our web URL. So I need to write web URL, then I want the reference of the list. So how I will provide it? I will tell that :/lists, and over here we need to specify the constant name which we have created $, and over here we need to specify the list ID, and what we want to access, we want to access the items. For that reason I am going to tell item. So we are done with the request URL creation. Once it is being done, then we will proceed further and we will write await this dot underscore sp dot get client. Then over here we need to specify then, and within that I will tell client which is of type ms graph client, and this is going to be the void operation. I will tell void, and within that I am going to define the body of the anonymous function, and over here I will mention client dot API. I want to pass the request URL which we have created to hit the graph endpoint. So I will tell that request URL, and which operation we want to perform. This is a create operation, so it is going to be the post. So we will tell post, and we need to specify what item object we want to post it. So for that reason we need to specify over here item obj. So now we are done with the logic where we are creating the request URL, and then we are creating the graph client, and from the graph client we are sending the post operations, and where we want to perform the post operation at this particular endpoint. Now we need to write the catch block. So over here I will write promise. If anything fails, so I will tell that reject that promise. So I will tell promise dot reject error, return the error. Now save it. So now we are done with the create operation.